Okay, so, but as a result of the fugitive slave law, we'll also see more states pass personal liberty laws beyond Pennsylvania and beyond like New York, which are kind of the first two. There's an additional 9 more northern states that pass that as well. In addition to that, in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is much more impactful than many of the other works that were being written about slavery because it specifically looks at slavery from the aspect of the family. That's something that you can identify with if you have a family of your own, right? The idea of having your own children ripped away from you is something that women could identify with no matter where they were at, or whether they were white or whether they were black. And most reform, both in the antebellum period as well as later in the progressive era, comes from women, from middle-class women. So this is directly targeted towards that audience, right? And they know that that's going to be their biggest audience from this. It ultimately becomes a bestseller in the United States, although the book was entirely banned in the South. And you could actually, in some southern states, be arrested for having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Nice. Yeah. But in the northern, because of its popularity in the northern states, it creates and pushes a larger abolitionist movement as a whole. There's not just this book, though. There are other books as well. Hinton Helper writes a book called The Impending Crisis of the South, and in his book, he argued that the South, because they become so tied economically to slavery, that it will ultimately lead to their economic downfall, because they aren't diversifying, they aren't doing anything else. So what happens if cotton prices fall? Well, the Southern economy will collapse. What happens if if people are no longer interested in buying cotton? Well, again, the Southern economy collapses and they have nothing else to build it on. So his book also is banned in the South. And he also argued within his book that slavery actually hurt more non-slave holding whites than it actually hurt African Americans to have slavery. But between these two books, we'll see the growth of the abolitionist movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book arguably grows the abolitionist more than Hinton Helper's book. And in fact, Lincoln is so kind of in awe of her book that he will say when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little woman who wrote that book that started this great war." So he really recognizes the impactfulness of the book. In addition to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the abolitionist movement that was growing, we also had other people pushing back against slavery. Individuals like Harriet Tubman, who was often referred to as like Moses because she led her people into freedom, right? Moses leads the people of Egypt out. But she will lead, after escaping herself, she will lead over 19 expeditions into the South, freeing over 300 slaves. Each time, mind you, that she goes into the South, she is at risk of being arrested and also at risk of being executed because of her ability to get people out. She was a huge threat to the people down there. During the course of the Civil War, Harriet Tubman will also become a spy for the Union and will run on spying missions, once again putting herself at great risk of being captured or potentially even being executed. But we can also see other responses to the abolitionist, or to the fugitive slave law through the growth of the abolitionists. We see this in Emerson. He basically argued against slavery in many aspects, and he argues that it is an immoral piece, and he argues that a law which enacts a crime of kidnapping is a crime on the same footing as arson and murder. A man's right to liberty is as inalienable as his right to life. William Lloyd Garrison talks about, and he says, 3 millions of American people are crushed under the American Union. The government gives them no protection. The government is their enemy. The government keeps them in chains. The Union that grinds to the dust rests upon us, and we will struggle to overthrow it. So again, he understands that we need to remove slavery, and that without it, our country really can't continue. But as more and more personal liberty laws are passed and as the abolitionist movement grows, the South also responds. The South continues to threaten secession if the laws themselves and the fugitive slave law are not enforced. And in 1855, they will once again demand even stronger enforcement of the fugitive slave law. They argued that under this new fugitive slave law, the federal government should be bound to ensure that over 1,000 slaves per year are brought back to the South, because that was the approximate number of slaves that were escaping from the South into northern freedom. They also argued against, or with the Fifth Amendment, arguing that their rights to property and their rights against unreasonable search and seizure were being denied by these personal liberty laws that were being created in states like Pennsylvania. And they also argued that the federal government's supremacy clause made it so that the fugitive slave law actually ranked higher than these personal liberty laws, and so therefore the federal government needed to be taking a more active role in ensuring enforcement of it. But despite the Southern's response to the lack of enforcement of the fugitive slave law, we will see that America will continue to deal and grapple with this issue of slavery. It continues to be a key piece in our elections. And switching gears, FYI, it wasn't on the fun fact yesterday, so I added it to the fun fact. John Tyler, who's our 10th President of the United States, fun fact Marley put up there was that his youngest was born when he was 70 years old, but John Tyler actually has 2 grandchildren that are still alive. Not even like great-grandchildren, but like grandchildren. Because in his bunch of children, his 13th son kind of repeated his dad a little bit. He had 6 children, 3 with his first wife and 3 with his second wife. And so in the second wife group of children, he winds up having 2 children that are born in the 1920s. So these men are pretty old at this point in time, but he does still have 2 surviving grandchildren. So random fact. What's that?
15.
Yeah, he had 15. Why is this starting way back down there?
So like pre-Civil War grandchildren.
Yeah.
That's crazy. It's like my grandpa was before the Civil War.
Yeah.
What'd your grandpa do?
Yeah. What'd your grandpa do? Oh, my grandpa was president of the United States. When? Well, he's like the 10th president of the United States.
That's so great.
Like, what?
No
No,
one
guess.
else? Or like old, like wow.
Really good team.
Do any of these people have grandchildren still alive?
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. hasn't been around for that.
We haven't been around for that long, yeah, but
Oh.
yeah, many of them still have like children that are still, or grandchildren that are still alive, and obviously like
My
some of
grandpa
them
was
still
born
have,
already.
you know, children even, but he's the oldest person to have still living relatives. Okay, so the road to secession, or oldest to have grandchildren still alive.
That's cool.
Okay, so again, the issue of slavery once again comes to a head at any of our political elections. In 1852, the Democrats will nominate Franklin Pierce. He's a Southern sympathizer and was in favor of the Compromise of 1850. The Whigs, on the other hand, will nominate war hero, Old Fuss and Feathers, General Winfield Scott. He largely kind of agrees with the fugitive slave law, but not entirely. And the Whig Party ultimately will become split over that fugitive slave law. He is more northern leaning, and there will be a southern division of the Whig Party as well. But Pierce ultimately will win 254 votes to a mere 42, and it becomes the death of the Whig Party. Under Pierce's presidency, Pierce believed in a much more expansionist America, okay? And he wanted to see the United States grow under this idea of manifest destiny. Southerners wanted Cuba. We see under the Southerners kind of plot to take Cuba. We have the Ostend Manifesto, which occurs in 1848, so a little bit before, but we see still Southerners wanting additional territory. And how do we gain that additional territory? In addition, we see Franklin Pierce. This is not Franklin Pierce, FYI. This is a guy by the name of... It is Commodore Matthew Perry. It is Commodore Matthew Perry, okay? But in addition to his expansionist ideas, he wanted to open up trade with Japan. Now this is actually pretty important to understand the forcing of the opening up trade with Japan. Japan is a very insular country. In other words, they don't get involved in the affairs of the outside world, and they very much just kind of stayed to themselves. Despite China being kind of carved up by the European powers under these spheres of influence, Japan has largely been able to remain like isolated. But the United States knows that Japan could be a key strategic partner in trade in Asia. I don't have a European map in here, sorry, or an Asian map. I do in my closet, but there's no room to hang it up, so it is what it is. But they understand it could be a key strategic partner, and if they are able to have Japan, whereas the rest of Europe has been unable to open up trade with Japan, it will give the United States kind of a leg up against these other European powers in Asia. And so what, under the kind of guidance of Franklin Pierce, we see Commodore Matthew Perry will take American ships American warships into like the seas outside of Japan. And an American whaling ship had been basically like kind of right off the coast of Japan as well. And Japan saw it as being a potential threat to them. So Japan actually captures this American whaling ships and takes the Americans prisoner. So Matthew Perry uses this as his like green light to basically go right in with our American warships into the harbors of Japan. Basically be like, give us our Americans back. And oh, by the way, if you don't want us to go to war with you, you'll open up trade. And we'll start becoming trading partners.
And we have guns.
Yeah, and we have guns and whatever else, right? And we have this big giant, not giant military like today, but we still have a big military. And this idea is, okay, either you open up trade with us or we're going to go to war. So Japan's kind of in this rock and a hard place. Either they trade with us, or they go to war, which they probably will lose against the United States.
So, like, the story Johansson told us last year was that I think the Emperor of Japan went to the harbor, and then as, like, a greeting, the ships all shot their guns at once.
Yes.
Did that happen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't a good situation for any means whatsoever at all, right? And so fearing death and fearing war, ultimately the emperor resigns and says, okay, we'll start trading with you. But it really begins this very negative relationship between the United States and Japan. And it is a part of what will eventually lead to Pearl Harbor. Okay? Does that make sense? That's the ripple effect of forcing open trade. So when we're talking about synthesis, that's synthesis. Does that make sense? Because of forcing up trade with Japan, it will lead to that negative relationship between the United States and Japan, which leads to Pearl Harbor. Yes, Paul?
Why did they want to trade with us?
Because the Emperor of Japan feared that Western influence coming into Japan itself would not only deteriorate their own culture, but also would potentially pose a risk to him as an emperor.
They weren't really wrong, though.
They're not wrong. They're not wrong. I mean, it's true. Anytime you begin trading with somebody else, your cultures are going to be intertwined. I mean, it's that simple.
Didn't Japan literally just...
Well,
We do it.
well, somewhat.
It's a great thing. Diversity. You don't need to be
Well-
a Korean Japanese person.
Well, this is the age of imperialism.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we're getting into imperialism. So second wave imperialism, not first wave imperialism. In addition to that, the United States wanted to take additional territory into Latin America. Most in particular, the United States wanted to build a canal. Because now that we are stretched from sea to sea, it becomes imperative that we're able to protect both sea to sea, right? And so it also means that potentially we could expand both north and south under this ideal of manifest destiny. But the problem with protecting sea to sea is that if you're going to take a ship, you have to go all the way around the tip of South America and get back up to the other side. So the only way that you can effectively protect both coastlines is if you can attempt to build some sort of a canal in between. Now, originally our idea for building this canal is in Nicaragua, not Panama, Nicaragua. Okay? And we feel that this will be a good kind of place for us to do this. Well, under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States technically shouldn't really be expanding into Latin American countries, but for sure we are not going to allow other European powers to have any kind of control in Latin America. But there are still some European countries, both Britain and France, that retain property and retain control of parts of Latin America, in particular, in this case, in Nicaragua. And so when war seemed inevitable between the United States and Nicaragua, it seems as though the British are going to come in on the side of and aid Nicaragua against the United States. In order to prevent war, the United States finally agrees to sign the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, and both parties consent to it, and basically it pushes off war and says, look, we want to build a canal. It would be beneficial for you, Great Britain, to also have a canal because, you know, you're Great Britain, and you also have colonies all over the world, so it would help you, too, to build a canal. But we won't start building a canal unless we have consent from you to build a canal. And that's literally all this treaty is about. Okay, it's a prevention of war, but also it allows for that. This will be changed a little bit later and amended in 1901. We will see the passage of what's called the Hay-Pontefote Treaty, and this will actually allow for the building of the Panama Canal in Panama. Okay, that's between the United States and France because Panama was actually controlled by France at that point in time. Well, Colombia, which was controlled by France.
Why do they settle on Panama? Because it was just narrow?
Because Panama is more narrow than Nicaragua, and so it would have been easier to build. Also, the French had already been trying to build a canal through Panama, and so they had already started some of this process, so the United States could just come in and take over the process of building the Panama Canal without starting all over from the very beginning. Does that make sense? So that was kind of the idea within that as well. Because the southern states wanted Cuba so much, we will see that there is at first idea under Pierce to buy Panama or buy Cuba. Unfortunately, it falls through. But he argues that he would, or fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know, depending on your view of American history. But we'll see he actually, and the Southerners were willing to pay $100 million for Cuba as a way to expand that slave territory. The last piece of expansionism under Pierce has to do with the Gadsden Purchase. Okay? The United States wants to build a transcontinental railroad. Now that we're sea to sea, we need to be able to connect this country so that we can move product from sea to sea. In particular, we need to be able to move gold much more quickly. So again, two ways to get across or to get from coast to coast. One, go all the way around by ship, or two, go by rail line until basically, like, you could get to, at this point, about Missouri, and that's about as far west as you could get on rail. Right? So then you get off in Missouri, and now you have to walk or ride horse or by wagon train or whatever else. Does that make sense? So it's very difficult. So the first idea for a transcontinental railroad actually argues that we should build a transcontinental railroad in a southern route. The reason for that is the southern portion of the Sierra Nevada mountains is at their lowest point. So it would be easiest to build a transcontinental railroad through the south versus through a midline through the middle of the country or even through the north. So, but the problem is we don't own this territory. We do not own this. Okay, so can you see that? Maybe that marker wasn't the best of markers. But we don't own this. That belongs to Mexico still. Okay, so the United States goes to Mexico and says, look, we want to buy this land from you. Okay. Now remember, our relationship with Mexico is not great, but Santa Anna has taken off with the vast majority of the money that we paid for, Mexican secession. So Mexico, quite frankly, is in a spot where they need money from the United States. Okay? So because of their own economic hardships, Mexico agrees to sell this portion of Mexico to the United States for $10 million. Okay? If you think about the context of that, right? That's like as much as we paid for
Some house.
everything else, okay, from Mexican secession. So, you know, it's a pretty good deal for Mexico, like, as far as the amount of land they're giving up for the amount of money. But then this would allow us to build a southern transcontinental railroad through this region. The problem with this is when a railroad goes into a community or into an area, what forms around said railroad? Towns. Populations go there, right? So if people come into this region in the south, it's a potential that as these towns grow, because they are southern, that we might see the advent of more slave states. So northern states did not want to build the transcontinental railroad through the south. Okay? They wanted to build a more northern route. Well, the problem is the southern states won't sign off on that transcontinental railroad going through the north, and the northern states won't sign off on building a transcontinental railroad. The northern states won't sign off on building a transcontinental railroad through the south. Does that make sense? Mackenzie, yes.
They can never do anything with slaves down in Arizona and Mexico anyways.
Well, yeah, and that's true, but I mean, Texas is not really a great place for slaves either, but Texas still comes in as a slave state. Does that make sense? So maybe you're not having like huge giant plantations, but maybe you're using your slaves in like housing type situations, or they're like cleaning your house or whatever. Does that make sense? Okay, so maybe not in large numbers, but some slavery anyways. So it is not until actually the outbreak of the Civil War that the United States will actually see the passage of the Pacific Railway Act, which leads to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Because despite the purchase of this land, we can never come to an agreement to actually build the railroad itself, which again highlights some of the difficulties between the North and the South. Okay. Now, in addition to the conflict with building the railroad itself, we have additional conflict when it comes to where to build it, and part of this also comes from Stephen Douglas. Okay, we said we're not going to build it through the south because of the problems there. Okay, but Douglas actually is from Illinois. Okay, and he owns a bunch of property in Illinois itself. Okay, so he wants to ensure the building of a transcontinental railroad through this midline route, because it would mean more money for Stephen Douglas as property values go up in Illinois. Okay, but the problem with that is this territory is largely divided into two sections. We have what amounts to basically all of this is the Nebraska territory, okay? And the question becomes then, how do we break up this territory? It can't just come in as one giant state. How do we break it up, okay? And how do we sell the South on breaking this up? So Douglas actually, in order to try to build this northern route of the Transcontinental Railroad, he basically argues that we should divide this territory. So we have Kansas territory and we have the Nebraska territory. And in order to do this then, and to convince the Southerners of it, he argued that within this territory, we would allow those individuals to decide based on popular sovereignty. Remember, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 dictated that both Kansas and Nebraska should come in free because they are above the 3630 line, okay? So if we allow them to do it based on popular sovereignty, then maybe they would be willing for a more northern route of the Transcontinental Railroad, okay? Ultimately, Douglas's attempt at changing and saying they're going to come in via popular sovereignty will ultimately be kind of the final nail on the coffin of the Missouri Compromise. So what we have wind up from that, and you can see it in the map, this map's better obviously than my map over there, is we had what was all of the Nebraska territory. We're going to take it and we're going to divide it up, so this becomes Kansas, this becomes Nebraska, and see, we were once part of Minnesota, North Dakotans, okay? Boo. Yay or yay, depending on how you look at it, right? But each of these then will be able to decide via popular sovereignty. And the South believes they can actually get Kansas to be able to become slave. Because if you look, it's right next to Missouri, so why won't it become slave? Okay? In addition to the issues over slavery, the United States also has another issue at the same time. Remember, nothing is that simple, okay? And what we see in 1845 is that American population is growing quite dramatically, and it's largely because of immigrant population. What's going on in the world that leads to such a huge spike in population in the United States?
Potato famine.
The potato famine, yeah, it's up there too.
French Revolution.
The revolution in pretty much every country.
Yeah, revolution in pretty much every country, but mostly we're getting from Germany and from Iowa. Does that make sense?
Wait,
Okay.
that's all the immigrants are taking in?
Yeah, that's where the majority of the immigrants are coming in.
Wait, no, like that chart is the immigration?
Immigration,
Or
yes.
that's not the population?
That's not population, that's immigration.
Yeah.
Okay, does that make sense? In thousands of people. So if we look at this between 1830 and 1855, we're going to see huge spikes in people coming into the United States. In fact, immigrants by 1845 make up 15% of our total population in the United States. Okay? And so as a result of this, it does also bring up additional issues within the United States. Most of them had a tendency to be Catholic, which brings up issues of nativism, but they also had a tendency to drink more as well. When we look at this, people made direct correlations between this influx of immigrants and other issues that existed in large cities. When we look at areas like Cincinnati, crime rate increased by three times and murder rate increased sevenfold. This is not necessarily a direct result of these particular immigrants or immigrants in general, but oftentimes is a direct effect of higher levels of poverty amongst people, as well as greater crowding in urban environments. So it really isn't an effect of these immigrants. It's not like they're the problem. It's really the infrastructure within our societies and in our communities that was the problem as a whole. The other problem with these large number of people coming in is these individuals now, as citizens, within 5 years, they can become a citizen of the United States, naturalized citizen, in 5 years' time. It also means that they can vote very, very rapidly. Now, in presidential elections, it takes 5 years, but if you're in New York, you can pretty much get off the boat and vote. Okay? Yeah, in the state of New York, just for local stuff. Does that make sense? Okay, not presidential, but local stuff. So when we look at this, foreign-born voters over this time frame increased by over 200%, where native-born voters only increased by 14%. That's a huge sway in your ability to change whatever is going to happen and change the outcomes of a local election. The vast majority of these individuals had a tendency to be Democratic and also had a tendency to be pro-slave. The reason they're pro-slave is because freed slaves would have been competition for jobs, right? And so therefore less jobs for them. They also had a tendency to be anti-temperance, but they also wanted greater funding for taxes and tax funding to go towards parochial schools, so Catholic-based schools, okay? Now when you have an increase of 200% of your voters, you can largely sway how that vote turns out, which also means that you can prevent the passage or any kind of temperance laws. It also means that you can get funding to go to your parochial schools. And this is something that native-born Americans, we're not talking about Native Americans like we think of Native Americans at this time, but they called themselves Native Americans. Does that make sense? But these are white people. But just to be, so it's perfectly clear, okay, it is white people who are born in the United States, so therefore they call themselves Native Americans. Does that make sense? Okay.
It makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it's like,
What they were talking about, like they didn't call Native Americans.
I mean,
yeah, and they did not call
They were
Native Americans
savages,
like we call Native Americans, right? So the lexicon is changing there. What?
just refer to as Indians.
They would have just been referred to as Indians still, yeah. Okay. Or savages or whatever. Okay, or some other much more derogatory term that I'm not going to repeat. Okay, what?
Variants of America.
Yeah, basically. Okay. So in addition to that, they also called for greater poor relief because that would directly help those individuals. And so like in Boston, poor relief increased by 3 times. They also pushed for greater changes in, we would see it in schools, in poverty. We see greater changes or pushes for changes in like housing and jobs changes. And in addition to that, we'll also see as a direct result of this huge influx of immigrants, we will see the rise of the political machines within our cities. So we're not going to necessarily get into the political machines yet, but understand that Tammany Hall and the Tammany Ring, which was created by none other than Mr. Alexander Hamilton in New York City, will wind up creating a huge political sway. And they basically say, hey, Irish immigrant, do you want a piece of bread?
We just got here from a starving vote. Yeah, of course.
I'll give you a piece of bread, you vote for Tammany, okay? Oh, Irish immigrant, you want a job? Okay, here's a job, go vote for Tammany. And they pretty much control the political world of New York City for the next about 60 years, okay? So, but out of the rise of this immigrants, we will also see those native men born in office who begin to push back against this. So we will see the formation of new political parties, including the American Party, and we will also see the creation of the Know Nothing Party. These largely were native-born Protestants, and they were part of an original secret society called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner and the Order of the United Americans. They were mostly skilled blue-collar workers in favor of temperance, but opposed to tax-supported schools because they don't want their tax money going to fund Catholic schools. Okay? When asked about their political party, they would merely say, I know nothing. Okay? And a lot of that comes from the merger of those secret societies. There's a lot of religious bigotry within the American Know Nothing Party, and as I said, they are very anti-Catholic. In addition, they sought to increase the period of naturalization from 5 years to 21 years. That way it takes those people longer to actually be able to have any kind of say in the vote. Ultimately, because of the connection from the Pope and slavery, because of Kansas-Nebraska Act, many of these, many of the Know-Nothings will actually wind up converting into the Republican Party. Nathaniel P. Banks is elected to Congress in 1854, and he's actually elected as a member of the Know Nothing Party, but initially, right away after he's elected, he says, I'm no longer a Know Nothing, I'm now a Republican. And so he takes a lot of people from the Know Nothing Party with him to the Republican Party also.
And then they know something.
What's that?
And then
And then they kind of know something, okay? So when we look at the creation of the Republican Party, it's largely because of the Know Nothing Party, but also the Kansas-Nebraska Act, okay? I apologize, that's cut off. I don't know why my screen is doing that lately, but it is, such is life, okay? And so when we look at this, and you saw this a little bit earlier, but the Republican Party is abolitionist, it's the Know Nothing Party that were against immigration. The National Republicans, which was the Whigs, now become the National Republicans, just go with it. They were Democrats who were exposed to the expansion of slavery, and they were also the Free Soilers as well. The Republican Party, it becomes the second major party basically overnight, but however, the Republican Party was not allowed in the South whatsoever at all. In fact, it was not even allowed on the ballots in the South. The creation of the Republican Party also can be seen as one of the short-term causes of the Civil War. It's not a huge cause, but ultimately 1856, when they nominate their first candidate for president, the South threatens secession, and 1860, when Lincoln wins, the South actually does secede from the Union. But there is also additional tension that we see, both sectional as well as ethnic tension, that exists within this. Now, Douglass believed that the issue of slavery could be peacefully settled, okay? And so he also argued that democratically it could be settled through the use of popular sovereignty, okay? Unfortunately, this will not be the case for poor Kansas. In 1855, a group of New Englanders called the New England Immigrant Aid Company sends 2,000 men to Kansas to stop the expansion of slavery. They come with them what they called their Breacher's Bibles, which was a breacher, was the company, but it was a rifle that they brought with them down into Kansas. So I don't know how you're going to prevent violence when you bring like guns with you, but such is their kind of ideal. Not to be outdone, Southerners who did not want Kansas to become a free state, wanted it to become a slave state, start coming in and flooding into the territory as well. Many of the individuals actually come from Missouri. They're not planning on staying in Kansas whatsoever at all. They're just literally there to try to ensure that a vote would occur that would ensure that Kansas becomes a slave state and not a free state. These people were called the Border Ruffians. They were the poor pro-slavery people from Missouri. Because of the tension that exists between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery factions that exist, the territorial governments, we will see two different government systems formed. And so Kansas will actually wind up with two territorial constitutions. The Lecompton Constitution, which is pro-slave, and the Lawrence Constitution, which is anti-slave. On May 21st of 1856, arguably what is the first battle of the Civil War occurs, in which skirmishes between the Border Ruffians and the Breacher Bibles, the New England Immigrant Aid Company, will erupt in violence in several locations. The first we see at Lawrence, then at Osawatomie, at Potawatomi Creek, and at Marais des Cloignes. So we see all of these skirmishes occur in those regions, and ultimately it looks as though the Civil War is already breaking out within the United States. And some would argue actually that it is the bloodshed in Kansas, Nebraska that is actually the first bloodshed of the Civil War, although we are actually not officially at war for another 4 more years. Yeah.
What was the name of the party with the Bible in it?
The Breacher's Bibles.
Okay.
Yeah. That was just their nickname. The Breacher's Bibles. Because they were the group was the New England Immigrant Aid Company. But basically, they're armed guards. Does that make sense? Okay. So both of kind of have these like armies that are set up right in there. But it continues to become a national issue, and no longer can we avoid the national issue in Congress itself. The summer gives way to speeches in Kansas about the crime that is committed in Kansas. And in one particular speech, Charles Sumner, who is a hardcore abolitionist from Massachusetts, begins his speech in the crime against Kansas. His speech literally lasts for 2 days. And he's just talking and talking and talking about this. Yeah, there's a few breaks in there, but it's pretty much 2 days straight, okay? He talks about how these border ruffians were murderous robbers from Missouri, that they were hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. And he goes on to talk directly about a senator by the name of Andrew Butler. So he goes on this large tirade about him. Now he calls Butler an imbecile and says that Butler has chosen a mistress, and that mistress is slavery. And he pretty much insults Andrew Butler for a good, couple of hours. So it's not even like it's a slight insult. It's like a pretty decent insult. Stephen Douglas, who is a senator from Illinois, sitting there in Congress listening to all of this, he leans over to another senator I don't know that other senator's name, but he leans over to another senator and he says, "That damn fool will get himself killed by another damn fool." And so really, again, kind of highlights that tension that exists in there. As a result of the speech that lasts 2 days, South Carolina representative, a man by the name of Preston Brooks, gets pissed because he believes that Sumner has gone too far. He believes that Sumner has violated the code of honor of Mr. Butler, which happens to be the cousin of Brooks. Okay, so Brooks believes that he must restore and defend his cousin's honor and defend the family. And so 2 days after the end of Sumner's speech, he goes into he goes into Sumner's office carrying a cane, and he goes into the Senate chamber and begins striking Sumner repeatedly with a cane. Over and over and over and over again. As he's striking him, he says, "You have libeled my state and slandered my white-haired old relative. Senator Butler, I have come to punish you for it." Okay? And he beats him so long with this gold-tipped cane that the cane literally breaks in half. Okay? Eventually, other members of the Senate actually come and physically restrain Brooks and pull him off of Sumner, but literally it takes them like stepping in and pulling him off to end this pummeling. Northerners are pissed and they call for Brooks's removal from Congress. He doesn't actually get removed, but he resigns and goes home. He's fined a mere $500, and when he returns home, there's these like giant events held in his honor, like literally parades and all sorts of things. And although he's resigned, the midterm elections come up and he runs for office, or he doesn't run for office, they just re-elect him without his name actually being on the ballot. So they liked him that much that they put him in place without him actually really wanting to be there. In addition to that, they send him replacement canes. So he gets thousands and thousands of these replacement canes, so that I guess if he wanted to go back and beat Sumner some more, he could do so. Unfortunately for Sumner, who also winds up being re-elected, is so injured by this beating that he's unable to actually go back to work. In fact, Sumner will suffer both psychological and physical injuries that will last him the rest of his life, and he was quite frankly lucky to survive the beating that was put upon him by Mr. Preston Brooks. As a sign of the horror that was and the atrocity of those Southerners, his seat remained empty for the remaining time. So although they could have re-elected somebody else or brought somebody else in to fill his seat while Sumner was healing, they choose not to, and they just leave his seat empty there as a symbol again of, look what you've done. This is what this has come to. But as this is going on, and as this crime against Kansas is occurring, so here's our actors in this. I'm sorry, it's so hard to see. Okay, that is Charles Sumner. Okay, and this is Mr. Preston Brooks. Okay, both very dapper-looking dudes there. Okay. And this is a political cartoon that comes out of this. So the Southern chivalry. Okay? And I always love looking at the dudes in the background, because look at the other members of Senate. They're all laughing. They're like, ha ha ha. Okay. So I find it funny. And if you look closely, he's on his paper scroll here. It says Kansas. So this idea that that's what he's talking over, and what the issue was. Okay, so as this is going on, violence in Kansas will grow quite dramatically. And it grows largely because of this dude, okay? Interesting looking fellow, right? Okay, so John Brown is a Northerner and also an abolitionist, and he believed that God was calling to him to help end the expansion of slavery into additional territories. So John Brown and his sons go down into Kansas, and they wind up in a skirmish with 5 other men at an attack in Lawrence, Kansas. In this skirmish, John Brown and his sons slaughter 5 of these men with their swords. He uses a broadsword against them. So if you don't know what a broadsword is, if you've ever watched Braveheart, it's like a big gigantor sword. So that's kind of sweet. What's that?
Well, killing somebody with a gun is one thing, but killing them with a sword.
Yeah. Okay. But also it kind of shows his craziness, right? John Brown's a little on the crazy side, but he's fun. But he's, like I said, he believes he's doing God's work, and ultimately John Brown and his sons are not put on trial for their attack and their murder of these 5 men in Kansas. So he actually believes that this is an even bigger sign from God, that he is meant to do this, and this is what he should be doing. And that he should continue along this path of kind of pushing against slavery in a violent way. We'll meet you again, Mr. John Brooks, after just a little bit, okay? In the election of 1856, Pierce has largely been considered ineffective. I'm sorry, yeah?
You said John Brooks, you meant John Brown.
John Brown, I'm sorry, yeah, John Brown, sorry, yes. Pierce is ineffective, and so the Democrats instead decide to choose a different candidate. They nominate James Buchanan, who is pushing for popular sovereignty, and the Republicans nominate John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont is a Republican. We'll have to pick up with him a little bit tomorrow, and then we'll get into your writing. We'll talk about Dred Scott, and then you guys will do your writing. Dred Scott.
I will.
Dred Scott.
If we're not here tomorrow,
If you're not here tomorrow, it's in the Book of Knowledge,
oh, it
so
is.
just do it in there. If you have questions about it, ask me, okay?
Okay, what does it do?
Connor?
Hi.
We will